The Iztapalapa Causeway was the longest of three connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland. It is believed the Iztapalapa Causeway was 5 miles long from lake shore to city. Halfway along its course over the lake, the causeway and aqueduct ran through a small island the town of Acachinanco was built upon. The island town of Acachinanco, like Tenochtitlan, was located in the salty waters of Lake Texcoco, and the inhabitants relied on the aqueduct running along the Iztapalapa Causeway for their drinking water. This simple fact of everyday life in Acachinanco fulfills Plato's criteria for Atlantis. The small Aztec island city, several miles offshore from Tenochtitlan, exactly describes Plato's outer ring islands supplied with water by aqueducts at the bridges. The Spanish conquistadors are silent about hot water being carried by either of the two aqueducts leading into Tenochtitlan. They are also silent about hot springs in the city. Surviving Aztec oral traditions suggest that hot springs once existed in Tenochtitlan. Decades after the conquest, the surviving Aztecs who lived in or visited Tenochtitlan before the arrival of the Spanish said certain worshippers of an Aztec deity named Titio were known to have access to sweat houses and steam baths in the city. Titio was known as the grandmother of baths and as Tamazcaltequi, the grandmother of the steam bath. Another Aztec oral tradition stated that a person could only be cured of diseases brought on by the god Tlazolteotl through a rite of purification involving steam baths. It can be argued that a man-made source of fire was used to produce the steam in Tenochtitlan's ancient steam baths. However, modern historians suggest the residents of Tenochtitlan had access to a source of hot water sometime in the remote past, probably from one or more hot springs located on the island. This fulfills Plato's criteria for Atlantis. Like Atlantis, the Spanish conquistador said the freshwater springs that supplied Tenochtitlan with drinking water emptied into storage areas and large basins that were surrounded by some of the city's most impressive buildings. Bernal Diaz del Castillo commented on large holding tanks with water levels that rose and fell dramatically. Tenochtitlan's holding tanks were connected to a tube that connected to a covered aqueduct filled with water that flowed from the mainland springs. The Spanish conquistador also commented on a large pond and tank of water located on one side of the Templo Mayor. There were public fountains as well. One of the principal fountains in Tenochtitlan was located in the heart of the city. The conquistador said women went there to fill pitchers. A modern historian wrote that when Tenochtitlan was first occupied, the Aztecs had no problem with drinking water because there were two springs on the central island that produced an adequate supply. This exactly matches Plato's criteria for Atlantis. It's interesting to note the modern historian referred to Tenochtitlan as the central island, exactly as Plato referred to the city of Atlantis in various parts of the story. Plato said some of Atlantis's spring water was diverted to plantations. We find a similar situation in Tenochtitlan. To help feed Tenochtitlan citizens, the Aztecs lined the perimeter of the outer city with chinampa beds. The chinampa was a type of landfill created in the water of Lake Texcoco. Individual chinampas were multi-acre parcels of highly productive farmland that provided up to 7 harvests per year. The space between chinampas formed a canal and allowed passage for a canoe. The canals between individual chinampas were fed by the outflow of Tenochtitlan's spring water, and they acted as irrigation points for the farmland. The inherent nature of the chinampa allowed farmers to rely on the outflow of spring water from the city to sustain their crops when rainfall was scarce or drought prevalent. To a casual or infrequent pre-Columbian visitor to Tenochtitlan, the chinampas lining the perimeter of the city would certainly serve as an inspiration for the irrigated plantations of Atlantis. Plato said the palace in the city of Atlantis was on a hill, and it was fortified by rings of water and land. The fortifications of Atlantis made the city inaccessible to hostile individuals and invading armies. Pre-conquest and post-conquest Spanish narratives fail to mention if Montezuma's palace was built on a hill or rise. However, from the conquistadors' eyewitness accounts, we know Montezuma's royal palace in Tenochtitlan was completely surrounded by canals. In times of conflict, the canals surrounding Montezuma's palace functioned as an Aztec version of the medieval European castle moat. That ring of water provided the royal residence with an added layer of protection against potential outside threats. Sometimes the Spanish conquistadors called Tenochtitlan the Venice of the New World. The Aztec capital was crisscrossed by a network of wide canals that accommodated canoe traffic. There were many places where rings of water encircled land sections of the city. Bernal Diaz del Castillo makes this point very clear during the Spaniard siege of the Aztec capital in 1521. When describing the causeways connecting Tenochtitlan to the mainland, Bernal Diaz del Castillo pointed out the strategic advantage they had against the threat of an invading army. He noted the causeways weren't continuous roads stretching across the lake. They were segmented into 4 or 5 sections of land and water. Between each land segment of causeway, a wide opening was left so water and canoes could pass from one side of the causeway to the other. The wide openings between causeway segments were spanned with flat wooden drawbridges. During times of war, the Aztecs would raise the drawbridges on the causeways, trap an invading army on one or more of the segmented land sections, then pick the soldiers off with a flurry of arrows from canoes on the lake. And that is exactly what happened to the Spanish conquistadors when they retreated from Tenochtitlan on the night of June 30th, 1520. As Cortez's army fled Tenochtitlan on the Tacuba Causeway, the Aztecs raised the causeway bridges and trapped the Spaniards on a land segment of the causeway. The gaps between the land segments were too wide for some soldiers to jump across, but those on horses made it across with relative ease. The Spanish conquistadors took heavy casualties during their retreat to the mainland, a testament to the military features incorporated into the causeways of Tenochtitlan. Conventional roads also crisscrossed Tenochtitlan. Wherever a road intersected a canal in the city, a drawbridge was built to accommodate the uninterrupted flow of traffic on the road and the canal below. During times of conflict, the drawbridges in the city were removed from the roads, making access and assault of the city very difficult. The city canals were wide enough and deep enough to stall an invading army if the drawbridges were removed. Once again, the Spanish conquistadors learned that lesson the hard way. During the final assault of Tenochtitlan in 1521, Bernal Diaz del Castillo commented on the difficulties the invading Spanish and allied Native American army faced attacking the city when the drawbridges spanning the canals were pulled away from the roads. The Aztec capital had other unique military features that enhanced its defensive capabilities. During the siege of Tenochtitlan, Spanish conquistadors noted the only way a person could pass from house to house in the city was by a drawbridge. During times of conflict, they were raised. Also, all the houses in the city had flat roofs and built-in parapets that enabled the Aztecs to fight and shoot arrows from the rooftops while staying protected. Tenochtitlan was a military nightmare for invading armies and unwanted individuals. Spanish history provides a thought-provoking insight into the wisdom of Plato's words when he wrote about the inaccessibility of Atlantis to hostile forces. Plato said one of the first things the people of Atlantis did was build bridges across the rings of water so they formed a road to and from the palace. Tenochtitlan compares very well to this aspect of Atlantis. One of the main roads on the island connected the Iztapalapa Causeway to the south gate of the Templo Mayor. The conquistador said The road ran along the side of Montezuma's palace, and it had bridges spanning the city canals, just like Atlantis. Plato said there were channels at the Atlantis bridges, and those channels connected segmented rings of water. The channels were wide enough so boats could travel from one segmented ring of water to the next. The channels were roofed, and they gave travelers the feeling of boating through a tunnel. The bridged rings of land connected by the channel roofs were noted as being some height above the surface of the water. There's an interesting correlation between Atlantis and the Spanish conquistadors' description of the three main causeways leading to and from the Aztec capital. Wide channels intersected Tenochtitlan's causeways at regular intervals, and they connected separate rings of water that were formed by the natural boundaries of mainland, causeways, and the city. The causeway channels were wide enough for canoe traffic to pass from one ring of water to another. The channels that intersected the causeways were roofed with drawbridges, and they gave travelers on the water the impression of boating through a tunnel, just like Atlantis. The drawbridges connected the segmented land sections of the causeways, forming a continuous road over the lake to and from Tenochtitlan. It's uncertain how far above the surface of the lake the land segments of the causeways rose. They had to rise far enough above the lake so canoes could pass easily and comfortably through their roofed tops. That indicates a height of at least 8 feet. Plato said the bridges of Atlantis were 100 feet broad. They were enclosed by a stone wall all around, and they had towers and gates at both ends of the bridge. That's a big bridge with a width unheard of in Plato's ancient world. Again, Tenochtitlan stands up well to Plato's criteria for Atlantis. Cortes provided an excellent reference for the width of Tenochtitlan's causeways. The Spanish conquistador said some of the causeways could accommodate 10 horsemen riding abreast. That's the equivalent of a 4-lane automobile road with a center divider. That's a big bridge with a width unheard of in the early 16th century, just like Atlantis. During the final weeks of the siege of Tenochtitlan, the Spaniards and their Native American allies advanced some distance along the Iztapalapa Causeway before the Aztec defenders halted their advance. At that point, the Spaniards set up a base camp on the Iztapalapa Causeway. Cortez's Native American allies built houses for the Spanish along both sides of the causeway. The causeway was so wide at that point, the space between the houses left enough room for foot soldiers and horses to pass easily. It's unclear if the causeways, the bridges spanning the causeways, or the streets of Tenochtitlan were physically enclosed by a stone wall all around, as Plato wrote about Atlantis. It's equally unclear if any of the bridges or causeways in Tenochtitlan had gates at both ends. However, Bernal Diaz del Castillo reported small towers and fortified oratories on the Iztapalapa Causeway, validating Plato's observation about towers guarding Atlantis bridges. Tenochtitlan may fit the Atlantis criteria for bridges enclosed by a stone wall all around if the statement is viewed through the lens of a dike located miles offshore east of Tenochtitlan. Known as the Nezahualcoyotl Dike, it closed off the entire western portion of Lake Texcoco from the rest of the lake. It was constructed of stone and clay, and the top was fortified with a strong wall of rubble masonry. Both sides were protected by a strong stockade that broke the force of Lake Texcoco's water during times of inclement weather, and it kept the western part of the lake calm and level. The Nezahualcoyotl Dike was a long seawall that, technically, enclosed every bridge and causeway of Tenochtitlan with a wall all round. Plato clearly stated there were docks located somewhere in Atlantis. A large harbor surrounded the docks, and a vast fleet of merchant vessels lined the wharfs. The noise from the docks was loud, and it could be heard day and night. Once again, Tenochtitlan holds up well to Plato's criteria for Atlantis. The Aztecs built docks inside a large harbor located at the northwest corner of the island. The docks were a vital import-export exchange point for Tenochtitlan and the many cities in the Valley of Mexico and beyond. Tenochtitlan's docking facility was located very close to Tlatelolco, the biggest and busiest marketplace in Aztec Mexico. The canoes that came and went from the harbor were loaded with goods traded at Tenochtitlan's massive marketplace. The goods from the canoes came and went from the marketplace docks day in and day out, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Bernal Diaz del Castillo was stunned by the number of people in the Tlatelolco marketplace, and equally stunned by the volume and number of different goods being traded there. He listed dozens of commodities exchanged at the open marketplace. Cortes said the Tlatelolco marketplace was twice the size of the one in Salamanca, Spain, and it was always filled with 60,000 people or more. The noise from the marketplace was so loud the Spanish conquistadors claimed it could be heard 3 miles away. The loud noise from Tlatelolco's marketplace could be heard at the nearby docking facility a mere several blocks away, just like Atlantis. One last point to consider is the word Atlantis itself. The name Plato gave the legendary lost city is actually the Greek modification of the original native word, whatever that original native word may have been. Plato said the names used in the Atlantis story were modified or changed from their native language into words that would sound more Greek to his Greek readers, or they were replaced altogether with Greek words, such as Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis. There is nothing odd or unusual about modifying the names of foreign people, places, or things in order to have them sound less foreign or make pronunciation easier. The English language is full of these examples. If Plato modified the word Atlantis from an unknown foreign language, as he suggests, and if other place names similar to Atlantis can be found in pre-conquest Mesoamerica, then it can be argued the Greek word Atlantis is the modification of a word with a Mesoamerican origin, and the connection between Atlantis and Mesoamerica cannot be avoided. Ancient and modern Mexico are filled with words similar to the Greek word Atlantis. Here are some examples of the many Mesoamerican words sharing similarities to the Greek word Atlantis. According to oral tradition, the Aztecs came from a mythical place, an island in the middle of a lake whose name Aztlan evokes an idea of whiteness. Is it possible that in the distant past of Aztec history, Tenochtitlan was once called Aztlan? The passage certainly suggests the Aztec capital in Lake Texcoco. The passage also suggests that Aztlan is the root of the Greek word Atlantis. A number of words in the Mesoamerican lexicon share a remarkable similarity to the Greek word Atlantis. Such profusion of words sharing a similarity with the word Atlantis are found nowhere else in the world except Mesoamerica. This cannot easily be dismissed as a coincidence.
you